Okay, fine. 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 I'll talk about China. Hey, it's me, your bread tube dad, and I want to talk about Cold War II. Cold War Deuxième. Dos. I don't know what I'm doing with this bit. Honey, wake up. A new Cold War just started. So as tensions escalate between the People's Republic of China and the United States, it's probably about time that we get the record straight. What I'm going to do today is give you an idea of what China is without trying to put any type of Cold War spin on it. This video is going to piss off both people who have flags in their names on Twitter and people who have other flags in their names on Twitter. And since I can watch my retention dropping as we speak, let's just get into it, hey? China is experiencing unprecedented amounts of economic growth, so much so that it is poised to eclipse the United States in probably the next 10 to 20 years. And every country that's struggling to find a way to get their economy to grow asks the same question: how the fuck did they do that? And the way that they do that is they have a potent brew of old school socialism and even older school capitalism. This allows them some flexibility to different market trends, but it also allows them to, when they want to, wield huge amounts of resources and investment power into whatever it is they want to build. And so the PRC has a lot more control over the future of its economy than, say, the United States, where everything is private and out of the hands of the government. And it does seem in the last decade or so that China is starting to establish itself more on the world stage. China's involved in a race to put a person on the moon. They've got their own space station. They put together the Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to unify mainland Asia and Africa through a complex system of highways, which would reduce the dominance of Western countries. And recently, they were involved with brokering talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two countries that weren't talking to each other. And honestly, if you know the geopolitics of the Middle East, we're two poles of a little Cold War going in and of itself. And for a lot of countries that are trying to build an economic future for themselves and are looking at the United States with its many, many strings attached to development loans, or China's looking like a far more enticing alternative. And because of this challenge to Washington's single-handed hegemonic control over geopolitics in the last few decades, it's inevitable that the topic of the last time the US had a challenger, the Cold War, starts to become part of the conversation. And I would argue that using this Cold War narrative has profound consequences, not just for the People's Republic of China and the United States, but for the entire world. On the geopolitical scale, a lot of countries would prefer working with China because China seems to be less ideologically driven than the United States, in many ways not being super interested in pesky things like your human rights record, as an example. But the problem is that the Cold War was bad, actually. If you want to put what it was at its core, the Cold War was the emergence of two superpowers in the wake of the Second World War, who basically fought back and forth over who would have influence over different countries as they fought and got their way out of European colonization. And while it never resulted in the nuclear apocalypse that we all feared, though it came close several times, it did result in a lot of small wars, proxy wars, and violent conflicts that boiled on for decades and killed thousands, if not millions. I'm not the biggest fan of us having to stare down nuclear Armageddon anymore, and I'm also not a fan of proxy wars and guerrilla warfare in general, so let's just put the Cold War and file it under things we probably don't want to do again. And the reason I made this video is that it seems that, despite the dangers of the Cold War, there seems to be a growing media narrative trying to shape that these two countries inevitably have to be in conflict with each other. Both China and the United States are trying to massage different details and build a narrative around themselves that puts them as the protagonist of history and the other as the enemy. In doing so, they are perpetuating misunderstandings and driving up conflict when we should be driving them down, especially in the age when everyone has access to world-ending apocalyptic weapons of mass destruction. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm going to try and tell you the story of China without trying to sell you a side of the Cold War. And because my audience is primarily from the United States, and because YouTube is banned in China, obviously I'm going to be speaking more towards the narrative that China is this looming threat that is the dominant media narrative to most Westerners. China's portrayed as this malevolent force that's trying to dominate the world through territorial disputes and TikTok.
How many videos are on TikTok? Yes or no?
Meanwhile, China claims that they are acting against U.S. imperialism and are focused on letting all countries develop in whatever way they see fit for themselves. Just, unless they have a lot of rare earth minerals or something. And it's not like China doesn't have a point. The United States has a long history of practicing a form of imperialism after World War II by giving development loans to developing countries, but on those development loans come with a bunch of essentially strings attached that force these countries through either debt or through conditions on those loans to accept the investment of American firms and essentially turn countries' resources over to the United States. Then the United States sells this narrative that they are making the world a better place because look at all the economic growth they're building, while that economic growth in these countries is primarily going to just the upper 1%, while the majority of the country is either seeing no change to their standard of living or it's actually going down. And even when things are getting shittier for a lot of people, all they needed to do was redefine what poverty was, and then they could go around and claim that there are fewer people in poverty now than through any part of human history. And leaders of countries who don't play along with this process have a weird habit of meeting, let's just say, unfortunate and early ends. China, on the other hand, deals with countries through infrastructure investments and trade deals. But in exchange, the country's resources still fall under the purview of massive Chinese firms. Is that imperialism? I'll let you decide. And then we should probably answer a few questions. Why did China, a communist country, succeed when the Soviet Union failed? What got China on its path to ascendancy? And also, let's unpack a few of the more noodly and controversial aspects of recent Chinese history that you've probably heard about. And hopefully come to some sort of understanding, because this isn't just about China and the United States, it's about humanity and the world's shared future. Like it or not, the People's Republic of China is one of the world's most preeminent countries, and in the decades to come is going to play a major role in shaping the future of humanity. So let's just try to put preconceived notions aside, have an open mind, and see what we can see. I had to do a camera change real fast because I had to tear everything down to record the podcast. The podcast is over now. Time to make more video. All right, so this video took way more research than I usually do for a video. I spent like several weeks where I didn't leave my office for days in order to make this happen. And I know that a lot of people out there want to be researchers. They want to investigate things for themselves. Hell, there's a lot of people out there who do their own research and come up with interesting conclusions. But being in academia gives you some skills you can learn for researching, and it'd be great if we could find a way to box that up and train everybody so that they can research interesting topics of their own and come to conclusions that are sound and based on good sources. And who'd be better to teach us that than certified internet good boy Tom Nicholas? If only there was a way that Tom Nicholas, with his dulcet British tones, could teach you how to research like a real PhD student. And you're probably wondering why I'm on this digression, and that's because it totally exists. It's an entire course, and you can find it all on Nebula. Yeah, you walked into the Nebula zone yet again. Tom has a course called How to Research Like a PhD Student, and it, my friends, is fantastic. Fantatissimo. Fantastico. Good. It's good. It's good, and you should watch it on Nebula. And why should you join Nebula and take Tom's course? Well, lots of reasons, but I think one of the important things that maybe doesn't get across is that Nebula is a community-owned platform. The platform is owned by creators like myself, and the idea behind it is that we can make content without a lot of the constraints that YouTube or other video hosting platforms might put on our work. You guys probably don't notice this unless you're an internet creator of your own, but the way that these recommendation algorithms work is that essentially you have to make one type of content and you're really pigeonholed into that. And if you don't follow exactly what one very specific audience that the algorithm has decided you appeal to wants, your stuff is going to get buried. And if you decide to talk about anything that they think is controversial, which, includes a lot of accurate description of the news and of history, you might find yourself demonetized, in which all of the work, an entire month's worth of work, just generates nothing. So what's truly great about Nebula is that we can make whatever we want. We can make great and amazing things without having to worry about these constraints. And what's great is that by signing up for Nebula, you're directly helping us creators. There's no Google man in the middle to siphon off of us. And when you sign up for Nebula, you not only get access to the huge library of stuff created by our creators, but you also get access to Nebula classes, which are a huge library of classes made by our very own creators about how we make the stuff we make or appreciate different areas of the world we live in. If you want to learn how to appreciate music, if you want to learn how to understand the architecture of the world you live in, or if you just want to know how the sausage gets made in the sort of YouTube video creator space, it's all there, and it's all done by some of the best creators out there. So are you ready to take the plunge? Are you ready to join the Nebula community? If you sign up using the link below, you will not only be signing up and joining Nebula and getting everything it has to offer, but you will actually be helping me personally, specifically, with part of what you pay for Nebula the entire time that you stay a member. But more importantly, you get 40% off the annual membership, which totals to about $2.50 a month. $2.50 a month, and you get access to an entire world of high-quality exclusive content. It's a really great deal, and I really look forward to seeing you guys there. Let's get back to the content. Where do we start talking about China? I mean, I guess China. Okay, China. So the organization that would become modern-day China has its roots in this tumultuous period in early 20th century China, obviously. In the early 20th century, the thousands-year-long procession of dynasties and emperors fell apart and turned into this complicated, messy sort of republic, but not really a republic, sort of a period of like warlords and dictators. And in all of that, there was a leftist group, a communist party, if you will, that started its own revolt against this government in 1927. This led to a power struggle between nationalists and communists that would last, depending upon how you count, 22 years, or it's still in progress. The nationalists, or Kuomintang government, fought against the communists, only taking a small break, basically, to fight World War II. And even then, while the two parties banded together to fight the Japanese, collaboration between the two was minimal at best, and as the Japanese started to pull out of China, there was already a race to win the retreat, if you will. I talked a lot about this in a video I wrote for the Cold War YouTube channel as a freelancer, so I'll link to that and you can check that out. But basically what happened is that as the Japanese were retreating from different regions, as sort of this process of handing over the land to the Chinese people after Japan surrendered, they would find people to hand it over to, and the communists and nationalists tried their best to try and get the best positioning to win this surrender with. I'm not going to go over this blow by blow, but the Chinese Civil War broke out again almost instantly after the war was over, and the conflict ground to a halt in the late 40s. Some of the main points to stick out is that, one, the communists did have an interesting upper hand. They did win through some fairly innovative techniques, which was focusing on making sure that they do not do anything cruel or terrible to the average people. And as they would be advanced upon, they would disappear into the countryside and make it extremely difficult to find them. And so what happened was that the Kuomintang troops had a hard time locating communist troops because they had the loyalty of the average people, and average people would hide them or not give good information to the Kuomintang. And it led to them being able to play this really successful cat and mouse game. It was so successful that it eventually won out. And at the end of the day, the Kuomintang government was pushed back all the way to the island of Taipei or Taiwan, depending upon what side of the Cold War you want to play on. In fact, I just remembered that they didn't even wait until the war was over. In 1941, the Second United Front fell apart and they were already fighting, even while the Japanese were still there. But through their People's War concept, they managed to capture important cities and lines of supply. They managed to get a overwhelming amount of people on their side and eventually won the day. Since then, this concept of People's War has become a staple in insurgent warfare. The war ended officially in 1949 when the Communist Party declared the People's Republic of China, And the nationalists who had been retreated to the island of Taiwan declared the Republic of China. Both the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China claim that they are the rightful government of China to this day. If you were to look at maps in either country, they both claim that the entirety of the country is theirs. The communists had support from the Soviet Union. The nationalist front was full of corruption, and they had worse training than the communist troops. And just among the people, there was a lack of trust in the Kuomintang government. Now, initially, after the war was over, the United States, big Cold War player, as you all know, was hesitant to really give support to the Taiwanese people or the Republic of China. But after the Chinese intervened in the Korean War, they changed tune, and the U.S. made part of its greater Cold War strategy to not recognize the People's Republic of China, and instead to insist on the legitimacy of the government of Taiwan, which led to several very dangerous standoffs in the 1950s between Taiwan and China. Tensions between Taiwan and China continue to this day, and every time you hear about saber rattling, missiles flying over the country as tests, what you're seeing is essentially this tension, this incomplete Chinese Civil War still going on. Now, despite the fact that the United States supports Taiwan, in 1971, the Republic of China was pushed out of the United Nations, and the People's Republic of China was admitted. And since then, the People's Republic of China has been the representative of the Chinese state in the United Nations, and generally around the world is recognized as legitimate government of China. Furthermore, since the 1980s, there actually has been some attempts to tone down the war, maybe put a little bit more agreement, maybe try to even have some investment that goes cross-channel. But for the most part, it's still a tense standoff, and there still has not been to this day a formal end to the war between them. Also important to know as a factor of this war that millions of non-combatants died, and that both sides of the war were responsible for some pretty nasty atrocities. So at the end of the war was declared the People's Republic of China, the new communist kid on the block, and the leader of that country was a man by the name of Mao Zedong. And as the Communist Party moved from fighting a civil war to running a country, they found themselves with quite a mess. China is a massive country. It was at the time, but it is today too. It's roughly by landmass about the size of the United States. The United States is a pretty big country, but has 3 times the population. Furthermore, the communists inherited a whole political structural system that was based on what was little different than basically feudalism not long before. A majority of the population of the country lived under literal landlords, acting as almost peasant farmers. I don't think you need a political science degree to know that landlords and borderline peasant farmers are not exactly loved in the communist playbook. What Mao needed to do was take all of the land away from these powerful landlords and to redistribute it amongst the many people so that there was a more equitable distribution of land for farming. The way that this happened was a broad program of confiscating land from these landlords and trying to push policies that would empower people in rural areas. Mao was a really big believer that the rural people needed to be empowered, because at this time, China, to this day, it's still a problem that China has a massive disparity in power between people who live in cities and people who live in the country. This process of land reform took about 4 years, and by the end, you could rightfully say that the distribution of land and resources in the country had changed fundamentally. So they went from a system of landlords and tenant farmers to a more collective farming style. They encouraged farmers to join these humongous farming cooperatives and also encouraged participation in collective farming practices, which was taken almost directly from the Soviet Union. Probably should mention while they're doing all these economic reforms that the Soviet Union, at least under Stalin, had sent economic advisors to help with the transition and to help modernize China into a more modern state. The Soviet Union and China at this point were working very closely with each other, trying to build this new country. What's important to know is that this wasn't a strictly economic decision. This wasn't to just increase productivity, but it was also a political and ideological mission in order to fundamentally change the relations that different classes had with each other in Chinese society. Just think back to the Civil War that we just finished talking about. Peasants and rural people were critical to Mao's victory in the war. And so he did feel that there was a lot of revolutionary potential in people who lived in the countryside and wanted to empower them as a way to politically completely transform the country. Now, that was probably a very sanitized way of talking about the land redistribution. And I did say that I'm not trying to sell any one particular side of the war. It's important to know that this came with millions of deaths as landlords violently fought to maintain their privilege and power, and violent breakouts happened between the government and these landlords all over the country. And in this process, Mao killed and arrested a lot of landlords. I do wonder, if those landlords ended up in prison, would they have to pay first and last month's rent on their cell? But one way or the other, he did redistribute land, and a lot of Chinese people had a lot more power over their lives than they had before. And as far as my research can show, this was a fairly successful program. A lot of rural Chinese farmers saw their incomes increase and standard of living improve. Furthermore, there was a lot of rural development as more equitable distribution of resources started to enter into the area. And it even helped economically. Agricultural output did increase after this transition. So that was the first 4-year major restructuring of the entirety of Chinese society. What else would Mao get up to? The next project Mao needed to undergo was to ensure control over the country. As you can imagine, a civil war leaves a lot of breakdown of government control, and in a country that big, trying to keep tabs with all the different people and make sure that they're all following the same page and loyal to the same government can be difficult, especially in the wake of such a massive, decades-long conflict. So from 1957 to 1959, Mao went through a period of what he called the anti-rightist campaign, which was a project to essentially consolidate power around his government. This included purging a lot of rightists from the Communist Party, as well as many people who held political offices in various parts of the country. There's also several people who did this project along with Mao. Mao wasn't particularly educated in his own right, and so he had a lot of smart people around him to help him manage things. Some of these would be people like Peng Chen, but one of the important ones we should know is a very close loyalist of Mao named Deng Xiaoping, who will play a bigger role later on. Now, the definition of what made you a rightist and therefore deserving of being purged from the party really came down to a couple things. It was very murky, but the main things that they tried to find and get rid of were people who had issues with single-party rule, who were against communism, basically people who believed in capitalism, or people who generally had issue with the collectivization of society. Minimum estimates for how many people were targeted by the anti-rightist campaign are in the number of about 550,000. There are some estimates that go way higher, but of course, when we're talking about highly politically charged stuff here, and also a lot of writing from people who have an axe to grind against the Chinese state, the estimates vary quite a bit, and it's basically very difficult at this point to really get a solid estimate that really holds up to rigor. But the anti-rightist campaign was at least successful in its mission and really stamped out any attempts to turn China into any form of multi-party democracy and really solidified single-party rule. Now, this does imply that there's no voting in China, which isn't true, and also that single-party rule, it's definitely like less democratic, but let me try to break this down in a way that's not going to make me sound really messed up. What a lot of socialists thought about multi-party democracies is that they tended to represent different parts of the ruling class of society. You know, different industries and different parts of society would have their interests reflected in different political parties. A good example would be, like, say, in the 19th century in the United States, you had two political parties that essentially represented the elites. You had the Democratic Party, which represented the power of enriched plantation owners in the South and had a focus on rural economics and making sure that the agricultural industry is protected, which included preserving slavery, and the Republican Party, which was a party focused around industrialists, powerful businessmen in the North. They had a focus on increasing westward expansion and developing American travel infrastructure and industrial capacity, because that was the interests economically of the people who ran the party. If you are a communist, there's only supposed to be one class of society, the people, the workers. And so from their concept, multi-party democracies are trying to put in voices of the people who technically in a communist society shouldn't exist. There shouldn't be wealthy capitalists in a communist society. And so therefore, there's one voice, one people, one party. Just because that one party really entrenches a single person's power base. Next question. It also doesn't mean that there's no elections. I'm sure that there are a bunch of people who are going to be gathering on a frigid day in February next year in Iowa who know that even within a single political party, there is still decision-making over who the leaders are going to be and who is going to be representative. You know, like a primary is an example of a single party election. And yeah, there's a lot of problems specifically with, you know, like the American political party's primary process, but it is voting. It is elections. It is a form of voting. So it's certainly not liberal, but there is an argument that someone might make that it is representative of the people in a way that a liberal might not conceive of, but also there is an argument that in imperfect power structures where individuals have, you know, power-hungry ambitions, there's a lot less stop gaps to your rise to power. But another thing I mentioned about the anti-rightist campaign is that a lot of people were persecuted or purged as a result. And even the Chinese government in later years have admitted that there were people who were wrongfully persecuted and have gone to extreme works to try and rehabilitate people who had been victims of the process. So it certainly was a complicated event to look at in retrospect. And it would be ripe for discussion, except that the anti-rightist campaign is a sensitive subject and in China is still a heavily censored one. But after Mao's death, there were a lot of convictions that came out of the anti-rightist campaign that were then reversed. But yeah, Mao's China was not done having big, ambitious projects meant to completely transform society that were a little bit ill-informed or overzealous and resulted in a lot of people dying. And we kind of need to talk about the mother of all of them, which began in 1958, which was the Great Leap Forward. Now, if you had your typical Western education like I did before researching, the idea of what the Great Leap Forward was it was a thing where China, Mao, did bad thing, and because of bad thing, 100 trillion, thousand, million, billion people died, and now the entire human race is extinct because of communism. And before I dig deeper, I do not want to waffle or mince words. The Great Leap Forward was terrible. A lot of people died. A lot of people died, and in very terrible ways. It was a project that was extremely ill-informed, based on the fact that there was a lot of people-pleasing around Mao, and Mao's disdain for expertise and people who knew what they were doing in the area of industry and agriculture were ignored in favor of folk wisdom that led to tens of millions of people dying. But as I have ranted to many people in my life, including my dad, you do a disservice to history and understanding these things if you don't at least make an attempt to look at what was happening and try to understand what the motivations were and the mindset of the people who did the things, even if they were awful. It's the hard work of being a historian. It's something that I'm going to try and do right now. So the Great Leap Forward, it was an extremely ambitious economic campaign to, again, after transforming the social conditions of the rural classes in China, attempt to push the country forward into a new economic reality. There was this idea in communist discourse at the time that, as Marx predicted, the place where communism, the stateless, moneyless society where everybody would be running the world in a sort of almost like an idyllic version of like an anarcho-communist society, to get there, we had to have a society that had developed the ability to create commodities to the point where the creation of the things that we need to do required almost no physical labor to do. Basically, taking automation up to 1,000 to the point where we live in an almost post-scarcity economic situation. What Marx predicted was that because of that, socialist movements and communist movements would be breaking out in the most industrialized parts of the world. He predicted that Germany, Britain, these are the places where communism would begin around the world. But that's not where it happened. The places where communist movements broke out are among the people who are at the bottom of the rungs on the capitalist hierarchy. It was amongst peasant farmers, amongst colonized people. And so any communist movement that became successful found itself overthrowing a government and usually running a country that was not industrialized at all. or industrialized very little. When the Bolsheviks seized control of the Russian Empire, they found a country that was way behind the rest of the world when it came to industrialization and modernization. Same with China. They had this massive country that was overwhelmingly a rural society. Under the idea of Marxist theory, the idea would be, and this was a sort of innovation that Stalin sort of brought in, that then, in order to bring about communism and to be able to have the resources and means to fight the forces of capitalism that were, at this point, always trying to find some way to undermine the communist countries, they needed to industrialize, and industrialize extremely fast. They felt that they were under threat. They felt that they were always going to be on the defensive, and if there was a way for communism to succeed against the powers that had colonies across the world and a massive industrial base, you needed to do the same, and no matter how many people died to get you there, you would do it. It was a form of modernization and industrialization that was brutal and ruthless. And one of the things that's important to know about Mao Zedong is that he was a very big fan of Stalin. Mao and Stalin have a lot of very similar ideas, and the main break between the Soviet Union and China, spoiler alert for later, was because Mao did not like that Nikita Khrushchev was backpedaling on so many of Stalin's policies after he died. You still see some remnants of this in China's politics. Every time they refer to their 5-year plans, this is part of the Stalinist thinking, because Stalin's whole idea was to rapidly modernize the economy through these targeted intense bursts of development. And Mao planned to do the same to China. What Mao's government set out to do was to push development by empowering rural communities. He wanted to push for more collectivization of farms. He wanted to push for more industrialization in different regions, but also had some other of his more interesting schemes, like getting a lot of people to keep a forge in their backyard and have people make their own extremely shitty, low-quality steel. The idea was to push these regions to become more self-sufficient and to also just have more economic power. The problem, though, is that Mao's targets were extremely unrealistic, to say the least. His economic policies were not super sound, and his forced collectivization of farming had a lot of problems, and a lot more problems come up when you fuck with the process in which you get food, I have heard. This led to a decline in agricultural output, and furthermore, the government also tried to divest from agricultural focus and more into industrialization, further declining agricultural output. Also, there was this system of boss pleasing in the Chinese government, which meant that a lot of times reports about how economic progress was going, people heard more what they wanted to hear from their underlings than what was actually true. And so the fact that people were routinely not hitting these extremely ambitious targets never trickled its way up to the top, which meant that massive food shortages were going unreported. There are other examples of some economic policies. One of the big ones that's pretty famous is that there was this folk wisdom that rice paddies were being attacked by sparrows, and that sparrows were eating a lot of the rice, and that was decreasing agricultural output. So the government put out an effort to kill tons and tons of sparrows. What they didn't realize is that the sparrows weren't really eating the rice. They were eating insects that fed on the rice, and it led to these insects breeding out of control and huge decreases to the agricultural output of the country. You could imagine that in just this situation, a huge decline in the output of rice in China would be bad. When it became clear that this was an unmitigated disaster, there was some attempt to try and correct it, but very soon realized this was a failure, and it was declared as such by 1961. But the damage had already been done, and tens of millions of people were dead. It's hard to predict such things, but it was likely that China had been set back decades. The Great Leap Forward also led to cracks in Mao's power and leadership, and people around him started to go around his authority and towards figures that they felt were less ideologically and politically motivated, and more people who were what were seen as practical, people like Deng Xiaoping. But Mao wasn't done yet. Nope, because we haven't even gotten into the Cultural Revolution yet. The idea of the Cultural Revolution was to get rid of bad ideas, essentially, from Chinese society, specifically those that were either capitalist in nature or that came from a sort of traditional past that was counter-revolutionary, to eliminate any form of politics that wasn't an adherence to communism. The driving edge of the cultural movement were these groups of activated university students who were called Red Guards, who went on these denunciation campaigns publicly shaming or publicly denouncing people who had positions that were seen as anti-communist or counter-revolutionary. The Cultural Revolution created a lot of violence, a lot of chaos, and a lot of needless persecutions. And again, a death toll that is hard to really suss out. The Chinese aren't exactly forthcoming with how many people were killed in the Cultural Revolution. And everybody who does have an estimate seems to have some sort of ideological drive to either make it seem as little or as huge as humanly possible. Furthermore, the Cultural Revolution also resulted in the destruction of a lot of important historical artifacts and a lot of stuff that came from Chinese history that belongs in a museum, right? It also effectively caused a brain drain in leadership because a lot of the people who were focused, or a lot of people who were targeted by the Cultural Revolution, were people who were educated, were professors and such like that. And many of them, after being persecuted, ended up leaving. That is, if they weren't imprisoned, tortured, or put into forced labor. Universities were shuttered because Mao had this idea that intellectuals or people who were in education needed to get a re-education, what was called re-education through labor, and a lot of them were sent to these rural areas to work on like collective farms and stuff like that, rather than learn about, political science or economics or whatever. It was again another massively ambitious project on behalf of Mao that was carried through because of his force of personality and resulted in absolute political, economic, and cultural chaos. And even today in China, there's a large diversity of opinion about whether the Cultural Revolution was good or bad or a mix, and it is by far not a monolith. So, there are Mao things we need to cover for the Sino-Soviet split. Jesus Christ. Okay. So also during this period, when Nikita Khrushchev took over the Soviet Union, replacing Stalin because he was far too dead to keep being premier, Mao and Khrushchev really didn't get along. Understatement of the century. Mao hated Khrushchev. Mao essentially really didn't like Khrushchev's de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union and sort of backtracking on a lot of Stalin's policies, saw it as basically giving up on the revolution and turning into a reformist bourgeois ideal, trying to be accommodating and not trying to push for the society that Marx had written about. Despite what the Cold War might tell you, Khrushchev was trying to push for peaceful coexistence between the Soviet Union and the rest of the world, and Mao didn't want any of that and established a firmly aggressive stance towards the West as a result of the split. And so in many ways, when we talk about the Cold War, we think of it as a bipolar world, but really it was a tripolar world with the Chinese representing their entire own faction, and a very powerful one at that. It was also one of the first big ideological clashes that led to a division in the communist world. Something that would not be unique to it, but it meant that there were countries that were communist but were not aligned with the Soviet Union. Despite this breakup, they still collaborated because they had joint custody of the communist side of the Vietnam War, and they both gave the country support in fighting the United States. But eventually, things changed because Mao died, and his successors, he had one successor for a very brief period of time who was like a diehard Maoist. Overall, the leadership very quickly moved over towards somebody who had actually been purged during the Cultural Revolution, one of Mao's loyalists, a guy whose name I've been saying several times, a guy named Deng Xiaoping. Okay, Deng Xiaoping. I got to Deng Xiaoping. Let's do this. Deng Xiaoping had a fundamentally different vision for the future of the country, and is responsible for essentially shaping the Chinese state that we know of today. So I did puff him up quite a bit, but while we do consider Mao Zedong like the intellectual father and the revolutionary leader that created the modern Chinese state, if you really want to understand China as it exists today, you would probably do better by understanding his successor, Deng Xiaoping. Deng was a very loyal person to Mao, had been purged from the party twice, but yet never divulged secrets, never joined the other side, and always came back when Mao needed him. The reason why Deng and Mao had this sort of tumultuous relationship is because Deng was a die-in-wood communist. He believed in the communist mission, he believed in socialism, and he was dedicated to the revolution. The problem, according to Mao anyway, is that he was too conservative. He did not want the grand revolutionary project to happen so fast with a sort of like Stalinist type bend like Mao did, and instead wanted something that was more reformative, more practical, more of playing in the world, at least have a less antagonistic relationship with the whole world. And while there are a lot of leftists today who criticize Deng because he's mostly known for introducing capitalism to China, there's something to be said that China today is basically the only major socialist country that still exists. He succeeded where people like Mikhail Gorbachev, who tried to reform a stagnant communist government that had been existing for a few generations, when he tried it, it fell apart. Deng took a similar, very deeply troubled communist system that had now existed for several decades and tried to make reforms to modernize it and bring communism to the new age, and did so in a way that did not lead to the collapse of the Chinese state. That isn't to say that it was bloodless, that isn't to say that it wasn't brutal in its own fashion and still deeply illiberal, if that's a thing you worry about, but he did so nonetheless, while at the same time taking hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So the period following Deng taking power after the death of Mao is something called the Bulangfanzheng. Mandarin speakers, you already know the multiple terrible ways I've pronounced your amazing ancient language. You're just gonna have to apologize to me on that. Mandarin is an extremely alien language on my tongue, and I apologize. But what the Bulangfanzheng was essentially Deng trying to undo the damage and chaos caused by the Cultural Revolution and really tried to backtrack on a lot of the more disastrous programs done by his predecessor. This meant taking millions of people who had found themselves victims of the Cultural Revolution and beginning to rescind all of the charges put against them and rehabilitate them back into either the party or into society at large. Furthermore, he tried to undo the chaos created by the Cultural Revolution and bring a systematic sense of order and control over the whole situation. Instead of being focused on an ideologically focused purge, basically, of everybody who opposed the communist government, he did more work to try and be a little bit more loosey-goosey. Not entirely loosey-goosey, as we'll get, but being a little bit more tolerant of different viewpoints. On top of that, the Bulangfanzheng was focused on trying to restore order in the chaos that had been created by the Cultural Revolution. This was not the end of Deng's grand vision for how he was going to change China, but it was a sign that Deng had a fundamentally different vision than his predecessor and wanted to create a China that was more modern and one that played more into the world around it. As you can imagine, taking the vision of the revolutionary leader of a country and saying essentially that that person made a lot of mistakes and that we need to course correct in some pretty major ways was controversial, to say the least. Furthermore, that meant that China had a lot of heavy historical baggage in a very short amount of time that they needed to contend with, and a lot of things that, if they were too widespread in public knowledge, might cause a problem for stability. I did mention that he introduced stability as part of his main focus, trying to sort of tamp down the Cultural Revolution. So to say that taking the ideas of the revolutionary leader of your young revolutionary country and saying that this guy did a whole lot of bad and that we need to sort of backtrack and really change the way that we focus on things was controversial, to say the least. Mao still held a lot of sway. His cult of personality was one of the greatest, and by great I mean great in like large in scope and power probably in human history. And Deng was directly trying to say that Mao had made major mistakes. He had made major mistakes when it came to how to manage the country, and that led to a lot of people having complex feelings about the government turning ship. This is actually, funny enough, not too dissimilar from how things went in the Soviet Union after Nikita Khrushchev he did a famous speech where he pointed out that Stalin did a lot of terrible things and that Khrushchev was planning on course correcting to have a more involved with the world, less antagonistic mentality with the West, and an attempt to maybe undo some of the more egregiously cruel and intense parts of it. And that was called collectively de-Stalinization, which was exactly the thing that Mao hated about Khrushchev. So complicated, I should say. But nonetheless, he did not go full glasnost and perestroika like his counterpart in the Soviet Union would do later. He did a program that was focused on a few things. In fact, part of his program was to implement the 4 cardinal principles, which enshrined single-party rule in China. There were no glasnost and perestroika. This wasn't a liberalization program like you saw under Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. This was more a program of trying to control messaging and admit problems, but also to put some controls over future sources of political disruption. One of the things he did is he implemented the 4 cardinal principles, which enshrined in law single-party rule in China. The second thing is that Deng's government did not pursue legal punishments to a lot of the leaders and perpetrators of the Cultural Revolution, despite calling the Cultural Revolution a major problem and a setback and very damaging to the country. Furthermore, while pointing out that the Cultural Revolution was bad, they did not become transparent about it. Documents regarding the Cultural Revolution are still heavily classified and not available to Chinese academics or historians even to this day. The Bulong-Fangjeng period ended in the early 1980s, with Deng really moving away from Mao's focus on class struggle and more towards one focused on economic construction and modernization. Also, to undo the Cultural Revolution, he reintroduced university educations and also, reintroducing a lot of academics and intellectuals and allowing them to return to university positions, reopening universities instead of sending all the students to work in the country and actually getting people so they can develop a intellectual academic class of people. In order to enshrine control, Deng put into the Chinese constitution the 4 cardinal principles, which to this day are a major part of the guiding principles behind how China solidifies control of the country. And so basically these are 4 things, principles, driving ideologies that the government is focused on. If you try to undermine them with like public speech or anything like that, is considered a crime. So the first would be the belief in Marxism, Maoism, Leninism, and rulership by the Communist Party. So you might remember a few years ago, the whole Winnie the Pooh thing where there's a lot of work done to censor the Chinese internet. We'll get to censorship later. That's a huge part of talking about modern day China. But the reason that they would give for why they needed to censor all of this, like Winnie the Pooh and undermining of Xi Jinping, the leader of the country, was that undermined one of the 4 principles, which was the rulership or leadership by the Communist Party. This was trying to undermine Communist Party rule. But Deng was trying to forge a very unique path between trying to open up and allow for more free thinking, especially in universities, approved some wage increases for professors, and was preaching this idea of keeping an open mind and developing new ideas, but at the same time also warned against bourgeois liberalization. So the Soviet Union took more steps towards liberalization and eventually led to its complete collapse. China focused more on trying to open up and implement new ideas while avoiding liberalization, which meant things like freedom of speech laws and market liberalization and things like multi-party elections, which were seen as basically capitalist impositions on their socialist government. But again, because the leaders of the Cultural Revolution were largely unpunished or given very light punishments, there was this strong current of educated and very angry people at the government for letting Mao do this program, but then also not thoroughly punishing the people who did it, even when they did turn the policy around. So that was his attempt to undo the Cultural Revolution. The next thing that he went on to do was try to do a process of reform and opening up. He tried to get China to join the international community and participate more in the global economy. It was around this time that Deng introduced an idea that is important for understanding Chinese economic policy that sometimes is made a little bit of a joke, but I'll try to see if I can explain it from their perspective so you can understand it. And that is the term socialism with Chinese characteristics. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, a lot of communist governments believed that they were the revolutionaries in a transitionary period between the way things are now under a capitalist society towards this communist society, this stateless, moneyless society of the future, and that what was happening now was not necessarily communism as they saw it, but was the engine for driving towards it. essentially one of the big divisions between, say, your Marxist-Leninist Maoist and, say, an anarchist is that Marxist-Leninists would believe that in order to overthrow capitalism and end the current world order, you need an organized state, you need a military, you need all of these sorts of things in order to have the revolution happen and then come out the other end, while an anarchist would say that you need to live the principles of communism and sort of build the new society within the old. Other groups like democratic socialists believe that you can create the path towards communism without needing a violent revolution, but through electoral gains and through being able to control the policies of countries to piece by piece build the laws that bring towards communism. So Dengism, or communism with Chinese characteristics, is another viewpoint on the state of China as a process towards this, which is focused on what is essentially radical pragmatism. Basically, Deng made the argument that under a Soviet-style command economy, China did not have the production necessary to be fighting any revolution or building any communism anytime soon. He said that China was essentially in something called a primary state of socialism. Now, in order to build an economic powerhouse that could bring about communism in the future, they needed to embrace some capitalism and participate in the world economy to grow their own state to the point where they could then start to implement their more egalitarian socialist policies. And spoiler alert, I'm going to skip a lot of Chinese history between Deng leaving power and Xi Jinping entering power because several of the leaders between the two, and I should say that between these two, what happened was that individual leaders started to mean a little bit less, and the governments of China started to get run more by like a committee, like a Politburo type situation. But the idea of communism with Chinese characteristics was a central pillar, which essentially morphed into a socialism that has a high emphasis on economic growth and development. Deng also implemented a form of market socialism with the statement that markets are not inherently capitalist, which you can make the argument for. They're not the only country to have embraced market socialism. Yugoslavia was primarily a market socialist country, and also pointed out that you can have markets and economic planning at the same time. What they essentially did was have a lot of large firms that did act in a sort of market-based economy, but with a lot of government control and input in the process, and the ability that they could maneuver large amounts of investment and resources, and if they needed to, lots of control over different private corporations in order to achieve certain economic planning goals for the state. Also, because Deng pointed out that China is in this primary stage of socialism where it is basically just building itself up to the point where it can implement socialist policies, a lot more things that can be associated with capitalism, not only markets, but things like stock exchanges and private ownership, can be implemented in small and controlled ways in order to act as a driver of economic growth until they get to the industrialization point where more overt planning would make sense. So that was what Deng was proceeding forward with in theory, but what did it look like in practice? Some of the major things that he did was decollectivize agriculture and return to a sort of more private, company-based farming system. He also opened up the country for foreign investment and allowed companies from abroad to get involved in the Chinese economy and invest in it, and also allowed for entrepreneurship, for people to start their own businesses and develop their own companies. Also, in a much more controlled fashion than what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a prolonged period of starting to privatize different parts of the state's apparatus and basically turn into private corporations what was once public. Things that were not straight up privatized would then be contracted out to private organizations in a sort of grand liberalization and marketization of the Chinese economy and a lot of the functions of its state. This was enough so that a lot of the capitalist international community started to play a little bit more nicely with China, and as they opened up to more foreign investment, they got a lot more economically dependent on Chinese manufacturing and things like that, which led to a lot of economic growth. China saw a huge reduction in poverty as a result of this, and a massive boost in economic growth. Average incomes did increase in China, but it's important to point out, in a very not socialist-y way, income inequality also skyrocketed. I'm trying to avoid putting my own takes in here on this, but you can imagine that it's a really funny-looking socialism to have a country that calls itself communist, run by a communist party, and has billionaires and basically like private megacorps. Privatization meant a lot less government control over the means of production, and that also resulted in a whole lot more corruption. It led to a lot of economic growth, but that economic growth also came with a lot of environmental destruction and huge amounts of pollution. Furthermore, under advanced capitalist economies, it becomes more and more expensive to have children, which leads to fewer and fewer children and also an aging population. Furthermore, the Chinese government gets into another thing that drastically reduces the amount of children being born, but I'll get into that in a second, where they implement the one-child policy, which causes a major problem with aging populations as well. And so in this situation where the most powerful and relevant communist country on earth is China, with this massively powerful economy that is this strange hybrid of socialism and capitalism, it has led to a lot of socialists to have mixed feelings about the country in general, and a lot of question marks about the sincerity of this government's approach to Marxism, Maoism, Leninism as one of those 4 fundamental principles that they're based on. But it's also hard to disagree with the fact that it also resulted in a massive decrease in poverty, a huge increase in standard of living for people in China, and put it on the path to becoming the world's most dominant economic superpower, which it is just a little bit away from eclipsing the United States in doing right now. These reforms led to an increase in agricultural output, as well as a move towards cash crops, which are basically just crops that sell well on the market rather than feeding people. Foreign investment in private enterprise also resulted in a major increase in industrialization and industrial production in both major cities, but also in smaller villages where people could then set up their own businesses. China then joined the World Trade Organization and soon became the largest exporter of industrial and manufactured goods on the planet Earth. If you want proof of that, look at literally any object you own and find out where it was made. Furthermore, the government also moved away from making money through direct control of different industrial firms and moved towards a value-added tax, which actually resulted in an increase in government revenue. Now, to explain which of these different processes led to this massive increase in the standard of living for Chinese people, you have a big mix, a complicated mix of different takes and ideologies. If you are part of the capitalist Western countries, you would argue that they were taking more steps towards capitalism, and under a capitalist liberal ideology, the more capitalist you can be, the more money you can be, which I guess is one way to look at that. The other, and this makes sense to me to a certain extent, is that implementing these market reforms open them up to the foreign investment and sort of back them away from being a pariah and being on a Cold War footing with a huge amount of the richest parts of the world. China had a massive potential in raw resources and industrial base and human capital to become a huge economic power in a capitalist system. And a lot of this growth is them plugging into that system and really coming online because basically the countries that had all the money finally started doing business with them. But anyways, this led to China experiencing massive economic growth and outpacing a lot of other countries that were also liberalizing at this time or developing. So they went from being a little bit of a backwater, a very underdeveloped country, to quickly outpacing their fellow developing countries and becoming one of the preeminent world powers in just a couple decades, which, is a tough thing for us to really comprehend because we live on small, timelines, and we've had a kind of tumultuous last couple hundred years. But China's growth from where it was to where it is now is unprecedented in human history. There's no country that has been able to completely reinvent its economy in such a fashion. And I think it would make sense to point out that if they had just liberalized and become a fully capitalist society without some form of planning and investment with a focus on economic development and building that only state-run enterprises and public investment can bring, they would not have gotten to this point. Conversely, if they had stuck to their Maoist principles and really locked down and focused on sort of a Stalinist type of economic development in 5-year plans, it would have not only led to them being further made pariahs of the international community, but would have also resulted in a sort of stagnant, centralized bureaucracy, which is what the Soviet Union started to turn into, especially after Stalin's death, a sort of By the 1960s, 1970s, the ideological drive of communism in the Soviet Union was largely very stale, and the communist government sort of just became a bureaucracy that was a machine for essentially like a corruption-based way of getting things done. And it led to a lot of these weird committees and boss-pleasing situations that led to a country that was very conservative, very rigid, and really afraid of innovating or trying new things. And that, I mean, just ask anybody today, is there a People's Republic of China and is there a Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? That should answer your question well enough, huh? It's not like China didn't pay for it. The modernization and liberalization led to a huge amount of environmental damage. It led to a giant spike in income inequality and a major issue with political corruption that continues to this day. All right, so now we got to talk about one of Deng's famous initiatives that turned out to have more problems to solve the solution of a problem that didn't exist, and that is the one-child policy. The idea was that Deng and the Chinese government and a lot of people on a comment to one of the videos I made last year believe that the world or China was overpopulated and that doing so was going to cause economic distress, and so they implemented a policy that would try to reduce population growth or even get it to stop and retreat a little bit. Essentially, the rule is, can't have more than one kid. If you do, you could be liable for financial penalties, or in some situations, you might be subject to mandatory contraception or even sterilization. But this was also followed up with a big compliance program. So in many ways, it was like 50% public awareness, hey, don't have so many kids program, versus plus 50% like charging people fines for having too many children or possibly doing more draconian things if somebody breaks that rule even further. Did it halt population growth? Yes. I guess they can now boldly say as of this year, India is now a more populated country than China. Is that a good thing? Well, it's led to China having a lot of major problems. The first being that their economy is suffering from an aging workforce. As the one-child policy generation comes into their own and have become adults, they have found themselves with a large population of people who are older and require assistance and pensions and things like that, and a smaller population of people to work and, pay into the systems that keep all of the older people taken care of. The policy, though, is probably most infamous for the effect it had on gender. China, like most countries on Earth, have a major problem with the patriarchy, of a insistence on the importance of boys over girls. And in some areas, this led to widespread infanticide. There's really no way of getting around that. A lot of female children born during this policy were killed in order to ensure that the one child that they had would be a boy. Not only did that lead to a lot of death, but it also led to society and a major problem where in China now there is a huge gender skew where there's way more boys than girls. I'd say skew. It's not humongous, but it's enough to be a serious problem. The Chinese government has argued that this was an effective policy that prevented overpopulation and prevented about 400 million births, that it also allowed for more women to get invested in the workforce or to go into higher education because they were not overburdened with having so many children. And it did also follow up with a large investment in women's education, but by and large, as the multiple structural and social changes that came up, I didn't even talk about Little Emperor syndrome, where there was a major problem with like one kid having like 4 grandparents who had no other grandkids but them, and they got like this undue amount of attention. It became a whole sociological phenomenon and issue in and of itself, but the government did admit that this policy was misguided and did not work. In the last couple decades, they have retracted it to a 2-child rule, and now in the last couple years, it's been a 3-child rule. The 1-child policy also caused a lot of friction between urban and rural situations, because in urban environments, having fewer children is seen as more advantageous, but in a lot of rural communities, having lots of kids is sort of part of what keeps your agricultural startup, your farm, functioning. And furthermore, why does somebody who live in a rural farm need to worry about having too many children when they don't live in the overpopulated megacities of the country? But yes, the major issues of infanticide, sex-selective abortions, and just child abandonment, overloading of orphanages, and a lot of baby girls getting essentially given up to other families caused a lot of needless suffering. You're not going to catch me defending the one-child policy. That's all I'm going to say. It was a misguided effort. It led to a lot of demographic problems, and also all of that is just overshadowing the tons of suffering and pain caused and death caused by it. Yeah, no good. Speaking of no good, let's talk about the growing movement of dissatisfied, educated people, especially students who found themselves at odds with this controlling policy that implemented a strict control over like which government was in control and all that kind of stuff, leading to probably one of the most infamous photos and events in modern Chinese history, as I'm sure everybody is going to be aware of. Starting in about 1986, a student movement led by Fang Lixi and Wang Ruang, just going to go with that. These two people started a protest movement that started to spread to different cities around the country, especially in universities. Fang Lixi would do these lectures about the importance of academic freedom and freedom of speech and these sort of liberal values that Deng's government did actively avoid, despite connecting into a larger world government that had a lot of liberal capitalist countries, and their ideas started kind of pouring into Chinese society, especially into the more academic circles. But also there was a lot of complaints about widespread corruption and limited economic opportunities for academics. And the PRC keeps some pretty tight controls over information about this event, but there were some pretty large protests, some cities getting protest movements of as large as about 30,000 people. And while they had issues to do with freedom of speech and academic freedom, they also had issues to do with curfews and issues to do with the university curriculum. Eventually, the movement did quiet down without much changing in a pretty short period of time. It only lasted for about a year. And Hu Yaobang was the current leader. The protest movement forced him to resign, but his successor fired Fang, and furthermore, he sparked a campaign against excessive liberalization of Chinese society. To many protesters, this was seen as a form of success, so it's no surprise that in a couple years, this would start up again, and we end up with one of the most infamous protests in recent Chinese history. Inspired by corruption, inflation, and a desire for more democratic reforms, after the death of Hu Yaobang, in 1989, this movement sparked up yet again to try and push for more and bigger change. This one got even more intense. There were reports of sit-ins, hunger strikes, and massive occupations of big public areas. And I'm not in the business of speculating too much about why they did what they did to follow up, but I can imagine that in the sort of mentality, as I've talked about seeing themselves as constantly under threat by the influences of capitalism and liberalization, that they saw this as essentially Western interference and bourgeois influence over their politics. And so the response was not good. It was brutal. It was essentially a complete violent crackdown using the police and the military in order to suppress this movement out of existence. Again, China keeps this under extreme control, but the amount of deaths and injuries has been recorded in the hundreds of thousands. Many political reforms that Deng had started to halt for several years as they reevaluated, and many of the leaders of this protest were either imprisoned or exiled from the country. But in the research, I did find that a lot of these protesters, while they did have a desire for more democratic reforms, I did not see a lot of capitalism being part of their desired ideology. A lot of it had to do with disagreements over different parts of the control of the economy and different levels of inequality and corruption and stuff like that. But I did not find anything about them being about more capitalism. But probably the most infamous reaction from the Chinese military was the clearing out of Tiananmen Square on June 4th, 1989, in which this famous photo was taken. The world responded with mass condemnation and shock. This really hurt China's relations with a lot of Western countries at the time. And as far as late 1980s political causes go, a lot of people were angry at the Chinese state for doing this. The government retains that this was a necessary and justifiable response. Doubt in my mind. But furthermore, to control the spread of this idea, Tiananmen Square and these student protests are one of the most censored things in Chinese media. And to a younger generation, these events basically didn't happen as far as their media diet's concerned. Yet to kind of wrap up the gap between the Deng administration and the Xi administration, This is a period where the individual leaders mattered a little bit less because they were more the head of a committee that had a lot of the decision-making power, and individuals didn't really have as big a role in really steering the boat and shaping policy. So China, between Deng's major reforms sort of out of the Maoist movement, led China onto a course that a lot of his successors definitely played with and managed and played around the edges of, but didn't do any like major course changes. But these leaders did have to deal with issues to do with foreign policy, with North Korea, with Taiwan, with Tibet, and they also focused on a lot of rural development, trying to get the more rural country areas to have more economic growth because the difference between the cities and the country had grown even more stark. And because of the increasing liberalization and the importation of outside ideas, these protests and demands for more democratic stuff and more freedom of speech were responded to by greater controls over personal liberty, more censorship, more an attempt to economically benefit from a globalized economic order, but not have the ideas of these liberal capitalist countries come in and afflict the population. So as China got the internet, they put in the massive Great Firewall of China that prevents a lot of people from accessing the wide stream internet. Their internet and a lot of their television and other forms of media are heavily censored, all in order to, in their minds, control outside liberal forces from coming in and undermining the four major principles that run the government. And during this period, China hit another major milestone in 2012 when over 50% of the Chinese population were living in cities rather than the country, showing that there's, as with the rest of the world, a great movement of people out of the rural areas and into major cities. The last leader before Xi Jinping was a man named Hu Jintao, and she came into power in 2012. She came into power with an idea of doing a bit of a course correction to the Dengist motives and put more centralization over the Chinese economy, and furthermore deal with the massive problems of corruption caused by liberalization. Xi Jinping is an interesting figure, and of course I'm not going to be able to talk much about his grand idea for how the country should turn out because he's currently the leader of the country, but there's a few things that you can talk about his major ideas for how China should be and how he differs from the leaders that came before him, and specifically of the Dengist idea for how China should function. The main thing that he did, in stark contrast to the leaders who came before him, was moving away from that more committee and council-based leadership and put more power into his own hands. He's removed term limits and has filled the Politburo with a lot of people who are directly loyal to him, giving him much more as one person direct control over the future of the country's decision-making than previous leaders, probably since Deng. He's tried to develop a new philosophy on communism with Chinese characteristics, but as well as a new idea for what China's role in the world should be and how China should run itself, to the point where a lot of his writings and some of his own thinking, Xi Jinping thought, as it's called, has been directly added to the Chinese constitution. Xi is the only person who has had that happen in the constitution, except for Mao. Xi Jinping thought at its core is about, on the longest scale, it's inevitable that one day socialism is going to triumph over capitalism. That there is a day that will come, possibly soon, where their model to the world is going to shape a lot of the ways that countries develop, and furthermore, that the capitalist order cannot compete to a communist one. He also recognized a lot of the issues that came with the failures of communism in the Eastern Bloc and plans to make the default idea of what communism should be to be one that is more focused around the idea of communism with Chinese characteristics. But the other thing that Xi is well known for is having a more assertive foreign policy. China in the past has been happy to make deals and grow its economy by making trade agreements and all sorts of things, but didn't really get involved in sort of great power geopolitics very much. They were perfectly satisfied to get rich, make money, make trade agreements, but not really worry about war and peace and whatnot. Xi represents a bit of a break from that. His belief is that China should have an assertive role in building cooperative systems around the world in order to achieve greater global development for everybody. This has resulted in things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially a large mega infrastructure project that's designed to basically connect all of Asia and Africa through a major highway system that connects back to China. The idea is that a lot of these countries, especially these formerly colonized countries, have a lot of their infrastructure designed just to export things to the coast where it goes to Europe and the United States. China is trying to counter that by building rail networks and road networks that would connect the continents together in a way that doesn't require basically exportation to Western markets. Is that self-serving? Yes. Does that put China at the center of their new vision of the global economy, making them very, very rich and exploiting a lot of countries that have lots of mineral resources? Is this a fancy way of taking the colonial railroad that went to the West Coast and just taking it and having it go to the East Coast? Well, it's more complicated than that, but it's not an unfair criticism. Under Xi, China has had more participation in the United Nations and international organizations, and has started to set itself up as the future leader of the world in much the same way that the United States does today. This has also involved a massive increase and buildup of the Chinese military, which in the past had been shockingly small, and turned it into one of the largest military forces on Earth. This is also paired with a modernization of their navy and an expansion of their territorial waters in the South China Sea, even going to the extent of building artificial islands that would extend their territorial waters further into the South China Sea. This more assertive foreign policy has been called wolf warrior diplomacy. China is no longer just a silent broker happy to make money off of making deals with everybody, but is now an active participant in trying to shape world order to move away from the capitalist oligarchy. It is also manifested in many of the Chinese wish lists. Saber rattling with Taiwan started to pick up, even though in the decades prior to that, there actually had been a little bit of cross-channel cooperation and a little bit of actual collaboration going on between China and Taiwan, but that has since fallen apart, and now tension between China and Taiwan, with on top of that, the United States' backing of Taiwan, has made it into an even more hot and on a list of places where nuclear war could realistically break out. Taiwan is probably near the top. Another part of wolf warrior diplomacy is that China is getting more involved with brokering international agreements. One of the most famous in recent times is that the leaders of Iran and Saudi Arabia began talking to each other again, a thing that had not been happening for several years. And that is two sides of a regional Cold War that had been going on between the two powers. Iran had already had good ties with China, and Saudi Arabia has been moving more and more in China's direction over the years. So it could be that in the not-too-distant future, China brokers a sort of détente in this Cold War struggle in the Middle East, which could settle a lot of really brutal conflicts happening in the region. As I've also mentioned, that Xi in the party congresses has built more power around himself specifically and centralized everything under his own authority. He's also centralized in an economic sense, where Xi has pushed for more government control over the Chinese economy, rolling back ever so slightly some of the market and liberal reforms that Deng had put in place. Furthermore, Xi has put in more controls over access to information for Chinese people, has doubled down on surveillance and censorship in the state, all in the name of trying to establish an illiberal state in a liberal world order. Some foreign policy wonks, albeit admittedly American ones, have criticized that China has a sort of wanting to have its cake and eat it too when it comes to foreign policy. Like, they want the benefits that come with being a world leader, of having these big international deals, but don't want to get involved in international incidents in the way that a real world leader like the United States would want to. I think this is a little misguided and doesn't speak to the fact that part of Xi Jinping's wolf warrior diplomacy is that a belief that all countries should have the right to develop in the ways that they see fit, which sounds really nice and does involve a lot of, like, China not getting as actively involved in other countries' shit like the US does. But it also does mean that they're willing to make deals with countries really irrespective of what their human rights record is. Okay, with all that, we can then talk about China's censorship policies, which is one of the strictest on Earth. The 4 cardinal principles implemented by Xi Jinping set the basis for a censorship regime in China that's designed to maintain the preeminence of the Chinese Communist Party and their leadership over the country, as well as the preeminence of Maoist, Marxist-Leninist, and Communist Party thought. This means that some topics of ideology are off limits for discussion. that certain subjects like democracy or more capitalism is considered basically undermining of the state and therefore not legal. Now, while the principles are not up for debate, discussion about them and different interpretations of them are allowed. So there is, again, we're looking at it through liberal Western eyes. And while I don't personally like suppression of people's freedom of expression, I do think that it is important to mention that from their own perspective, the idea is that, these principles like Marxism, Leninism, these are not up for debate. The Chinese government is willing to do whatever it needs to do to make sure that it never stops being communist. But when it comes to different ideas about what communism means, how to develop forward, those kinds of things, they do allow debate and discussion in that sphere. And since Xi Jinping took power, censorship has gotten even more intense. Pretty much every major form of mass media, from radio to video games, has a very intense censorship regime put in place by the PRC government. The logic behind it is that preventing people from criticizing the state basically ensures stability. And in modern day, Chinese apps like WeChat have entire censorship departments within the company. And any Western company that wants to have their website or their business or their products happen in the country have to collaborate with a Chinese company and have to go along with Chinese censorship laws, at least in regards to how the product rolls out in their country. It also puts a lot of controls over events in Chinese history, like the Cultural Revolution, as well as attempts to suppress things that have to do with belief in like the supernatural and the occult. Like in my experience, because I, was really into Blizzard Entertainment games, before everything would do with them, their censorship regime in China involved like getting rid of the term ghost in StarCraft because they did not want media that said that ghosts were a thing, which was a great misreading of what those things were. But furthermore, like they had some stuff that had to do with morality, like trying to censor bones on undead creatures and getting rid of like skeletons and stuff like that, which, is a little excessive. They just don't want to see dead bodies, I guess, or depictions of dead bodies. But I mean, like, you can't show blood in video games in Germany, as far as I can recall. So it is part of it. But overall, like, I'm not defending Chinese censorship. I'm just saying that it's big and multifaceted and incorporates a lot of different things, ranging from like political speech to their own history to like simple things like trying to suppress the occult and the supernatural to things that they considered like, violent and stuff like that. And of course, this includes prudish and bigoted ideas about morality. Pornography is illegal, but also like positive depictions of LGBTQ plus people are banned while negative ones are allowed. And there's also heavy restrictions put on media that comes from foreign sources. Again, because they don't want the sort of, corruption with liberal ideas to various people. So only a handful of movies and TV shows that come from other countries are allowed in each year. And it's especially harsh when it comes to stuff that's designed for children. And furthermore, because of official atheism, a lot of religious text is heavily censored and controlled. And to which extent missionaries and different religious practices can happen in China is very regulated. For several social media websites like Twitter, Facebook, and this website, YouTube, are all banned. So there's nobody in China is watching this video, unless you get a VPN or something. But even then, they're starting to crack down on those too. Text messages are censored. The game Hearts of Iron is banned. So I know a lot of fans of that are in the audience here. So you can't play Hearts of Iron in China. Education's heavily censored. There's some accusations that they've whitewashed history, which is likely true, but also looking at like what Florida is doing to their history curriculum. Are we really on the high horse about this one?
I'm telling you people, the earth revolves around the sun. Burn him!
What a story!
You've stolen my soul!
And so, yeah, the Chinese censorship regime is vast and covers a lot of ground and results in a group of people who have basically everything they see and hear extremely filtered, and everything that they say and do surveilled and observed. And if they get out of line, they could find themselves in a lot of trouble. One of the other topics that's very heavily censored, and one that I need to talk about, is, of course, in regards to China's actions in the region of Xinjiang. All right, so we're going to be talking about Xinjiang and what the West claims as a Uyghur genocide. I'm going to start being extremely fucking careful with my language right now, because this is when we are talking about China having accusations of genocide put against it, ones that are probably in need of some explanation and definition, but ones that are not, again, unfair. And I want to make sure that I have clear definitions and that I am not either playing into a Cold War narrative, but I also am not a person who wants to buy into genocide denial. So I'm going to try my best to talk about things on the ground as we know about them. Of course, because of the censorship regime, information is extremely hard to get accurately. And so I'm going to try my best. Please forgive me. This is what I could find out. So Xinjiang is an autonomous region in Western China. It is the home of the Uyghur people. Uyghur people are a Chinese Muslim majority population that have a distinct and unique culture that's very similar to a lot of other Central Asian cultures in the region. It borders Mongolia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. So it's also a very geopolitically complex region, and it is one that China has a lot of interest in maintaining and centralizing control over, which also makes things difficult because it's literally on the opposite side of the country, of this massive country, from the major centers that are on the Pacific coast. During the later years of the Qing dynasty, Xinjiang got a measure of independence and declared itself as the Republic of East Turkestan. But during the revolution, the People's Republic of China brought it back under their control. Although the region does have some form of autonomy, there was an effort to put in economic development in the region, but it's never really sat super well as a stable part of the country. There have been uprisings and resistance to Beijing's rule from the beginning. And in recent decades, there has been an escalating tension as battles between government forces and Xinjiang separatists have broken out across the region. In their efforts to solidify control over the region, as well as set up economic development, and in order to use essentially a propaganda effort to ensure that the Uyghur population gets more in line with Han Chinese culture and moves away from their own Islamic culture. They have done many things that could be considered cultural genocide. And in that, even though the sources are sketchy, I will say a lot of the accusations of the Uyghur genocide come from essentially like a right-wing fundamentalist Christian, but these are the accusations that they've been accused of doing in their efforts to essentially establish control of the region and culturally change the region to be more in line with essentially Han Chinese culture. They've been accused of mass detention and internment camps. The Chinese government says this is an education center, but, again, accusations of coercive birth control, of organ theft, and mass reports of sexual abuse and violence. And of course, just huge amounts of surveillance, including collection of DNA and massive use of high-tech surveillance in order to track the Uyghur population. These actions have rightfully garnered international condemnations from countries around the world and NGOs across the board. It led to diplomatic boycotts of the 2022 Beijing Olympics. Uyghur diaspora communities around the world have tried to pursue legal actions against the Chinese government in various countries, especially in Turkey. China has responded by a blanket denial that these have happened and a campaign to try and make the argument that this did not happen. Classic genocide denial behavior. This is, as far as I am able to garner, the on-the-ground information that I was able to put together about what was going on. And I definitely would not put it past the Chinese government to do something like this, because we have seen the excesses that China will go to in order to ensure control. And if they felt that there was a region that was not bending the knee to their will, I could see them going to such excessive measures and essentially committing mass murder in order to do so. Furthermore, it seems to be an acceleration of an ongoing multi-decade mistreatment of the Uyghur people, but because the West didn't particularly care for several decades if Muslim people were being oppressed. I mean, There was an anti-Muslim genocide in Myanmar. There's extreme anti-Muslim oppression going on under Modi's government in India. The Uyghurs also just sort of fell under the radar until it became geopolitically useful for the West to condemn China over it. But as a person who studies atrocities, who actively campaigns to stop genocide deniers, and who is a person who has done a lot of research combating Islamophobia specifically, it's terrible. It's inexcusable. And I'm betting that in the years to come, as more research comes out about what happened there, we're going to hear some pretty horrible stories. Also, in recent events happening in China, there was the events that unfolded in Hong Kong. To give you the brief rundown, Hong Kong used to be a British colony. Until the late 1990s, 1997, I want to say, their 99-year lease over the city ended, and the city moved from the hands of the British over to the Chinese government. The thing, though, is that as China went through this whole process of becoming the People's Republic of China and developing this whole communist system, Hong Kong developed very differently in its own sort of Western model as a British colony. As part of the handover agreement, the Chinese agreed to have sort of a one country, two systems approach, where Hong Kong would have decades before it would be integrated into the greater Chinese system, and they would have a degree of autonomy and freedom that the rest of the country did not. The thing, though, is that decades before the real end of this process, the Chinese government was already doing things in order to solidify more direct control over Hong Kong. Hong Kong had experienced a rash of police brutality, and these protests broke out in order to stop this sort of takeover of the Hong Kong government and to put a stop to all of these brutal acts of police aggression. The protests have led to a rising separatist movement within Hong Kong, a big swell of emigration from Hong Kong to the rest of the world, and serious uses of police brutality against the people of Hong Kong. Eventually, because of the timing of the Hong Kong protests, the COVID-19 pandemic and China's extremely hard response in order to stop the spread of COVID led to the dismantling of a lot of the protest movement. Again, the international community condemned China for its actions and expressed their support for the Hong Kong protesters. Chinese came out with their narrative, which was that these were just separatist rioters and needed to be suppressed. And again, as we're getting closer to the present, coming up to events that happened like 3 years ago, I am trying to, in this video, resist Cold War narratives. And so I can only say the things that I know happened on the ground, that there were protests, that they were explicitly stating that they were trying to get more accountability and better oversight over the police and to reduce police brutality. And in the crackdown has spurred more interest in separatists and more people to leave the country than probably actually were involved in the protest to begin with. So in many ways, China's violent crackdowns, yet again, created more enemies than they actually suppressed. So that is like the majority of the history that I wanted to cover. I want to kind of get into a little bit of the main factors at play as we look forward and see Chinese politics play out over time so that you can understand what the sort of major things going on are. The first would be the dynamic between traditionalism and revolution. China is a country with thousands of years of history and culture to build upon, and it is also a country that was built on an explicit revolutionary zeal designed to overthrow the old order and put in a new system that would be better for everybody. This dynamic between this ancient culture that has a lot of traditions that go back millennia and this revolutionary country are still a source of tension within the country today and still come up fairly often. China also has major pull between its rural and its urban areas. Like most parts of the world, the wealth in China is collected in these big cities, and rural areas are over time emptying out as people move to the city to find better work and to build better lives for themselves. And as we see with Xinjiang and in Hong Kong, there's also a tension between central and regional authority. China is a country that wants to have a lot of centralized power in the seat of Beijing. The problem is that China is humongous. It has multiple provinces, literally over 1 billion people, and keeping tabs on everything going on in every corner of the country is virtually impossible. And Beijing has to, within different levels of resources, implement control over these different places, and deal with different regions that have their own agendas and philosophies. Mao was really into centralization, Deng was more into regionalization, and Xi seems to be more into centralizing things again. It's a sort of cyclical pattern as China tries to find this balance between regional authority and central authority. The CCP's position on this at the moment is that economic development is going to be a balm on any sort of pains that these regions are experiencing. And that, divergence from the central authority can be assuaged if you can build roads and factories and cities and help them out. The other tension that has been a big thing in China ever since the Dengist reforms is communism versus capitalism. China is a country that officially is a communist. It has a centralized authoritarian government and a planned economy. It also has several megacorporations, an extremely powerful market sector, a stock market that is off the charts, and a thriving business scene. And so since Deng, the Chinese government has been moving more towards the capitalist side, but in recent years, ever since Xi took power, it has been drifting back more towards the communist angle. How much control the government has over the economy, it varies. And they have this strange mix that you really don't see in any other country, where the government does have a lot of influence over the private industries, but the private industries are still private to a certain extent. The sort of hybrid capitalist communist model is very complex. And of course, there is the tension between Xi Jinping's China and the United States. China and the United States have had a long history since the 1970s of mutual economic cooperation. They've had conflicts, but the two of them have experienced a lot of mutually beneficial agreements. In recent years, this relationship has broken down. As China starts to establish itself more as an equal to the United States as far as world powers go, China has been talking about trying to build a more equitable relationship between the two countries. It has been asserting itself more in the world, which since 1991 has been seen as the sole domain of the United States. And in many ways, this part is hard for me to really have perspective on, because I grew up in the 1990s. I was born in 1988. The Soviet Union fell when I was a toddler. So I have only known a world in which the United States basically acts as world hegemon and dictates terms to countries all the time. To see another country doing that feels very strange. But in many ways, I also feel like that should make me squirm a little bit, because why? I mean, I guess I have been a big foreign policy critic of the United States, but it is weird that I see China acting more aggressively on the world stage in a way that feels different than the United States, even though they are both intervening in other countries' affairs in different ways. But where we are right now is that these two countries are on a diametrically opposed path. America wants to preserve itself as the single global world hegemon. As it continues to decline in its economic power, as it loses its status as a global leader around the world. And China, the rising star, wants to establish itself, become the new world leader, or at least to participate in a multipolar world order in which the US doesn't constantly dictate terms. Where we go from there is really up to the international community. Unfortunately, us normal people who are not billionaires and are not politicians have very little say over what governments do, whether or not they decide to let us have an election. So really it comes down to what powerful people want to do. Do we want to have a renegotiation of our agreement and realize that the United States can't really dictate terms anymore, and build a new world order that has an alternative to capitalism kind of in it? Or is this diametrically opposed worldview going to result in more geopolitical tension, more proxy wars, and more close calls with nuclear Armageddon? I probably like the former, but my gut says it's going to be the latter. I can't think of a single empire that has gone down without a fight. And that means, to my fellow Westerners out there, that we're going to be living in a cultural, linguistic, and media ecosystem that is going to be actively working on a project of building a narrative of China being the great enemy that needs to be defeated, just like what happened with the Soviet Union in the middle 20th century. And if there's one lesson that you should take away from this video here, is that Countries and peoples are complicated. And while there's going to be this drive to build a narrative of people as the great villains of history, we have to also, even if we think what they are doing is abhorrent or disagreeable at best, we have to look at what they are doing from their perspective. And if we don't agree with it, at least try to understand it on its own terms. Otherwise, we are just going to be playing along with a narrative that tries to drum up more violence, more war, and basically do the duty of establishing a furtherance of the American empire. China is a land of contrasts. It's one of the world's leading contributors to climate change and one of the largest investors in clean energy on Earth. It has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty with its economic development policies, and is also a fundamentally illiberal state that uses draconian methods to surveil and suppress the freedom of their own people. So yeah, in conclusion, shit's complicated, use your brain responsibly, and sign up for Nebula at nebula.tv/stepback. Fucking hell, okay.